Hi, and welcome to episode 3 of the Great Divide podcast. I've got Chris Palmieri. How do you pronounce it?
Palmieri.
Palmieri. See, I'm just tongue-tied.
It's a
Who's
Palmieri. You have to use your fingers like this. It's a Palmieri.
I'm not Italian enough. So you're the guy behind the Meridian Speedway, freelance railway, and recently come out with home shops as well, doing
Correct.
the freelance rolling stock for sale. So why don't you tell us a bit about yourself?
Well, I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, and I've been in a model railroad and rail fan family forever. My father and my uncles were both. So growing up, I got to see a lot of freelance model railroads and have a lot of exposure to a lot of aspects of the hobby. So that's not wasn't necessarily a Christmas tree train under the a train under the Christmas tree story like a lot of people have. But I was exposed to it and exposed to some model railroad clubs early on. So it's always just been something that fascinated me as a child, and I've not let go of that permanently. I've come away from the hobby and gone back to it several times, and it's always been there for me. And lately I found myself in a position where I've gotten back into the model railroad hobby, and I went back in as a freelance modeler. And you mentioned the Meridian Speedway. We'll probably get into that in a lot of detail in this podcast here. But as I developed that, I became more interested in other freelance railroads, and beyond the historical Virginia and Ohio and the Allegheny Midland and the Utah Belt, there are a lot of people out there doing really neat things today. And to get those cars or equipment or those railroads represented in my world, you've got to reach out to that person and say, can you make one for me, and I'll pay you, and they don't have the time, or I've got to source decals and make them myself. And I just thought, I think there's an appetite like mine out there. Let's see if we can actually have some factory painted freelance equipment done. So I've started a company called Home Shops, and it's been pretty exciting. We've got a lot of things in the pipeline here, and the response has been very positive. So we're going to move forward with that.
Yeah, well, from what I've seen on social media, it's actually been quite a big reception towards home shops in terms of like the traffic that I've seen go through on your Facebook page, for example, and people just talking about, oh, this is awesome. Why hasn't this been done before? But a lot of the time before, I remember it was like you'd look in Model Railroad and you'd seen the news, club listings, and this club's doing these cars with like AccuRail, and this club's doing this, and you'd see like now and again that sort of thing. And maybe there might be Utah Belt. They did, I think, LBF company a while ago did some of their cars. I think Intermountain's done some like Allegheny Midland and Virginia and Ohio stuff. But what was that? Fox Valley.
Fox Valley did some Gevos, I think, and some box.
That's right, they did those, yeah. But yeah, like either way, it's been like before, it didn't really seem like it was marketed that much. But now it's like there seems to be a real appetite for this sort of thing.
I think social media gets 100% of the credit for that drift in popularity. There's Facebook groups directly dedicated to freelance modeling, and that's kind of where I've gotten a lot of the ideas or seen a lot of the interest in. And home shops would not be possible without the advances of social media, because, to your point, somebody advertises a run of club AccuRail cars in a magazine. Well, enough people have to see that ad and be flipping through that magazine, and fewer people look at magazines nowadays. So I've reached out and had several clubs reach out to me that say, I've got this stockpile of AccuRail cars that we did 3 years ago or 5 years ago, and they're not going anywhere. And I said, well, where can I go online to see and buy one of these? Well, you can't. You got to come to one of our shows, right? And so you have some organizations that are behind the curve as far as technology and social media and using that to move cars. But there's enough people now that are on board that if you use Facebook and Instagram and YouTube,
it's definitely been a big thing with social media. That like you've been on a modeler's life. I know that Lionel talks a lot about social media being a huge thing that's really pushing the hobby and like making all these connections. Like speaking of those Facebook groups, I wouldn't have come across you if I wasn't part of those Facebook groups. And it's the same sort of thing for a lot of other people. Like it's just helped make those connections that just were never there before.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I would not have met you. I mean, we're how far across the globe are you and I? And we're sitting here having this conversation right now about freelance railroads. So it's definitely not something that would happen in the magazine era.
It's not even something I thought of like would be happening when I was younger in the hobby. It's back then that was the print media, but nowadays it's all digital.
Correct. Just double checking here. It is recording.
And,
okay.
Yeah. So onto Meridian Speedway, you sort of talked about growing up with your family around trains and coming in and out of the hobby. What really kicked off with the Meridian Speedway and what got you sort of started on where the path that you sort of ended up now?
Well, the seeds for that actually got started many, many years before I knew the seeds for that got started. So growing up in Louisiana, my father was a member of the Southeast Louisiana chapter of the NRHS, National Railway Historical Society. And it was a very different time. There weren't liability issues today, and we had a lot of short line railroads, and the organization had its own passenger car. And every summer, that car would be on a different railroad, and we would have a van trip on a short line railroad in Mississippi or Louisiana or Arkansas. And a number of those railroads were Georgia Pacific short lines. The Georgia Pacific Paper Company had 8 short lines total, and a number of them were clustered in the area that we grew up. And there was a fellow named Russell Tedder that was the Georgia Pacific's president of all of those railroads, and he was very friendly to us. He is now passed away, but he facilitated a number of those trips. So as a kid, one year we would make a road trip up to the Arkansas to ride on the Fordyce and Princeton Railroad, or another trip would be for the Ashley Drew Northern Railroad, and another one would be the Gloucester Southern Railroad. And they all had this common paint scheme of green locomotives with the silver trucks and silver fuel tank, and they would just, you could tell that those guys took pride in their railroad, and the equipment always looked good, and they treated us not like we were a nuisance, but they were truly seemed genuinely happy that we were on the property with that interest. So I didn't think too much of it at the time, but coming full circle many years later, when I decided I wanted to go freelance railroading, there's many questions to be asked and answered when you decide you want to freelance. And one of them is, what is the scheme and the appearance of your equipment going to look like? So you've got to decide, is it going to be just a dip color, or are you going to have an elaborate paint scheme? And you start looking at prototype images to get some inspiration, and you look at freelance images to get some inspiration to see what it looks like. This would be something that A, is doable, and B, would be attractive, and that you want to be the image of your railroad. And as I started looking around, go ahead.
This is something I brought up in the first episode, and the one with I was speaking with Drayden. We're talking about having like a believable sort of image, and it's like you've also got to think in the business sense how much money you're sort of spending on these things. So the more elaborate it is, the more it's going to cost. And if we're looking at short lines like Drayton does, would they really spend all that money, or would you be looking at something that's probably a little bit more basic, but still, an image you can get behind?
Yeah, and Drayton and I, we both have our paint schemes modeled after different types of short lines, because my green and white scheme they were short lines, and it doesn't look simple because of all the white striping. And I will share a screen here. See if we can have everyone look at the home page to my website, so that everybody knows what we're talking about. That's the paint scheme. So it looks really elaborate, but it's actually not, in the terms of all of the underframe, the trucks, the fuel tank, are silver. It's one color. And then everything.
Like you've got solid blocks of color.
Mm-hmm. And then everything else is painted green, with the exception of the top of the walkways, you know, around the locomotive. You know, I painted the top of that black, but everything else is painted green. So the painting process is relatively simple, very little masking needed. And actually those walkways I can brush without masking. So if you're going to spend the money to have decals made, you know, a simple decal doesn't necessarily cost more than an elaborate decal for the modeler. It certainly does in the real world. But so it looks like a very elaborate paint scheme because of the striping, but they're very simple to paint. So the nose decal wraps around. That's all one decal. The logos are separate. And
is the stripe down the side one piece, or is that painted and then?
Oh, it's painted. Or excuse me, it is a decal. Yep. And then I had separate decals made for the names of the railroads. Natchez Trace and Orient and Texas and Great Northern are the two that I written into the story that make up, you know, what I call the Meridian Speedway, the freelance Meridian Speedway. So
yeah, I can see the two different logos you got there on the different cabs.
So that, you know, as I started looking for paint schemes, I came across some pictures from these fan trips that I had taken, and those pictures immediately took me back to the memories of those trips and what it was like, you know, to be, you know, in the presence of this railroad and, you know, all the potential that, you know, those railroads could have moving forward. It was just a great image. And, you know, I don't think anybody ever went to the Ashley Drew Northern or the Fordyce and Princeton and said these locomotives look terrible. They're just sharp looking engines. So I thought let me see if I can morph that, because it's not an exact replica of that paint scheme, but it's very, very close.
It's definitely its own thing, and you've just personally, it's like you'd look at a group of these together and it's like, oh, that's definitely a family. Like that's the same.
Yeah, and growing up in the 80s and the 90s rail fanning, you know, I had was able to observe the Union Pacific after they took over the Missouri Pacific and watch that canary phase, if you will, where they were painting, you know, blue Missouri Pacific engines in the UP colors, but they had Missouri Pacific written on them. So you could see a consist of locomotives going by and they would look the same, but some of them would be lettered UP and some of them would be lettered Missouri Pacific. And I also grew up, you know, with the Southern Pacific being a major presence, and they had locomotives lettered for Southern Pacific and they had locomotives lettered for the Cotton Belt. And I always thought that was kind of neat. It was kind of one of the fun things of watching those trains go by is, you know, was that a Missouri Pacific engine? And what is it lettered for? You know, it's just one of those things that caught out. So growing up in that environment, it seemed natural that a company might have different subsidiaries, if you will, within. So I kind of went the route of having two primary names for the railroads that make up the Meridian.
Well, you think about it, before all the big mergers that occurred in the US, there was still a lot of the regional names getting around. Like Cotton Belt was the thing right up until the end of the SP. It was like, what, mid-90s? So it's,
Yeah, and you know, the Cotton Belt stopped being painted on the sides of locomotives when they went to their speed lettering, the Southern Pacific speed lettering. But a number of those engines did actually have, they got painted with the speed lettering, and they would have SSW, St. Louis and Southwestern, sublettered under the numbers on the cab. So a lot of people don't remember or know that, but it still kind of was a little detail that was there. And as I've developed this network here, another thing I kind of borrowed, or what I really liked about the SP, was the shop cities were stenciled on their locomotives. You know, you would see a locomotive come by and it was assigned to Roseville or Eugene or Los Angeles or Houston or El Paso. And I like that. I like that territorial, you know, this engine is assigned to this place. So as you see a train go by looking at that, you can kind of get a feel for what locations are really important on this railroad. So I developed a few shop locations, and you know, here you can see this one is stenciled Tulsa and this one is stenciled Vicksburg. So those are places that I
and you're sort of given that sense of space, and it actually goes somewhere.
Yeah, and then
notice too, is that the locomotive class also on the cab there?
Yes, I had the original decal set I had made included most of the locomotive classes that I figured I would have on the roster. And the year that I model is 1996, so that's C40-8 on that one and B40-8 on the front one there.
You know, it's cool looking at, like, you've included all the little details that when you sit and look at photos of like the real thing,
Hmm.
you sort of pick up on these things, and it's like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, we've got that, we've got that, yep.
Yep. And then of course, you know, I grew up with the Illinois Central in New Orleans, and they went to that black scheme with the large road numbers on the side, and the Burlington Northern had large numbers too. The Ashley Drew Northern and the Fordyce and Princeton did not. But I really liked the idea that you could tell from a greater distance what the engine number was, and you know, there was its identity. So a change I made to the Ashley Drew Northern scheme, if you will, was to put the road numbers in large numbers on the long hood, and I made them italicized, so it didn't look just like an IC number or like a Burlington Northern number. I wanted it to be a little bit different, but those roads kind of gave me the inspiration for that component of the image of these
No,
engines.
excuse me. No, it definitely works. Like, just as a, like, if you look at it as at a glance, it's almost, is this railroad real?
Hmm.
You know?
And that's, you know, it's an art. It really is an art. You know, some people, you know, some artists trace an image and that's their painting, and that's fine. And that's kind of what I consider rivet counting to be, is, you know, you trace an image, and there's nothing wrong with that. I used to be a Santa Fe modeler, and I would find as many photographs of a specific locomotive as I could, and I would model it just that way, and that was fun for a while. And then it's, you know, I decided I wanted to have a little bit more of a creative hand in the image I created, so that my Santa Fe models didn't look just like everybody else's Santa Fe models. You know, you know, I would like to create something different in mine. And another inspiration, let's see, I've got a tab here called prototype inspiration. I wonder if we can
Yeah, I know
pull
your
that up.
website's definitely quite detailed.
It is, and I need to update some of it here. So I've got a slideshow on here. This is a trip that we made to Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was really the hub of the Mid-South. So this railroad from Meridian to Shreveport to with Vicksburg in the middle was an Illinois Central line that degraded greatly into the early 80s. I mean, it was mostly 10 mph and 25 mph speed restrictions, 1 or 2 trains a day. And it was kind of sad. And then the Illinois Central got into their spin-off phase, and where they created a number of regional railroads. One of those was spun off as the Mid-South Rail, the others being the Chicago Central and Pacific and the Iowa Interstate and the Paducah and Louisville, some of the other spin-offs at the same time. And this railroad, pretty scrappy, came along with a lot of, they had a lot of these old Illinois Central Jeeps, and turned what appeared to be a railroad on its last leg into viable as far as serving local customers. And they didn't necessarily upgrade the railroad a whole lot. I think it was still a relatively low speed railroad, but they kept it alive. And to me, that was pretty cool. You know, I grew up in a place called Mandeville, Louisiana, which was on the Illinois Central's shoreline branch, which is now ripped up and gone. And growing up, we had 1 train a day, 5 days a week. And it was, you know, 1 GP10 and 5 or 6 or 8 cars. And, you know, that was the biggest excitement, you know, growing up there as a child in Mandeville, was to see that 1 train. And then this railroad was kind of like that shoreline branch on steroids, because you had trains with 4 and 5 Jeeps, and they were 100-car trains. And it was, you know, the familiar equipment just repainted. So,
Geez, that would have been wild to see getting down the track at about 10 miles an hour.
And then along comes the Kansas City Southern. The KCS bought the Mid-South, and they had a different vision for that route. They saw that route as being a bridge route from basically from the East Coast to the West Coast. With that, the western end of this line having connections with the Union Pacific and with BNSF, and basically in the Fort Worth, Dallas area. And then the eastern end would have connections with the CSX and the Norfolk Southern. So it was an alternative. It would create an alternative route that would allow trains to bypass the busy cities of Memphis to cross the Mississippi River or New Orleans, kind of right in the middle.
Yep.
and it had a little bit more shelter from the natural disaster of hurricanes, you know, than the Southern Pacific and CSX routes on the Gulf Coast. So they came along and purchased this Mid-South and invested a lot of money. And you know, growing up in Mandeville and then later in New Orleans, it's not an economically booming part of the world. You know, the number one industry there is tourism, and people move to have careers and raise families. So not a whole lot of investment in infrastructure is spent there. And to watch the KCS come in and turn this railroad into a 60-mile-an-hour railroad with a number of new super sidings, they called them at the time. They were 8,800 feet long before people knew about PSR trains. And they revitalized this railroad. And I don't know if I've got anything from newer trips on here. Maybe I do. Here's one of those. I actually drew a northern fan trips that I mentioned. You can see the prototype locomotives and some of our passenger cars.
And you can definitely see the inspiration.
You can definitely see the
livery there.
You can definitely see the inspiration. I need to put an album on this particular page here with a visit to the Meridian Speedway as when in the KCS years. And I think
well, I just have to quickly ask.
Mm-hmm.
You don't actually happen to have any GP10s, do you?
I've not painted in this color. I do have one Intermountain GP10. It's painted in the Illinois Central black color, but I do have them on the roster, if that's what you're asking. You know, it's one of the many things to check off. Yes.
Seems almost like a staple of the area.
Yes, you know, and at the time when you saw them every day, you were less than impressed with them, and like
sick of them. Yeah. So
many things, once they're gone, you realize that was pretty cool. I miss those, you know. So, so there are some GP10s still on the roster that in 1996, the year that I modeled. So where was I going? Oh yes. So later trips to the Meridian Speedway when it was the KCS. There was one trip I went up there with several friends, and in a 24-hour period we saw 28 trains. So this railroad that was dying went from that to the Mid-South, resuscitated it, and it was alive with, you know, a couple trains a day. So you revisit the same railroad, and now it's been rebuilt into a 60-mile-an-hour railroad, and you can see 24 trains in a train an hour essentially on a single track railroad. That was quite a transformation.
So you'd almost wonder, would, like, if almost playing devil's advocate, if the Mid-South didn't survive, would this have become a main line for KCS?
Given what was going on at the time, it would probably have been abandoned and ripped up, because at that time most class 1 railroads were looking to reduce in size and weren't growth minded for a number of reasons. So it probably would have gone the way of the shoreline branch that I grew up on that ran from Bogalusa to Mandeville and Covington, and been ripped up.
Yeah, that definitely would have been a shame.
Yeah. So as I'm looking for,
now.
That would have been a shame. So as I look for, you know, what do I want my freelance story to be like, and how do I make it different from railroads that have been around forever? That transition of that railroad was inspirational for me. And I said, well, what if we just change some of the variables in that story and some of the timelines, and made it to where Georgia Pacific wanted to have an interest in that, you know, because basically it was a feeder line. A lot of traffic going to and from many GP paper mills were on that railroad. So what if, when the Illinois Central wanted to spin that railroad off, the corporation with the largest stakeholder was actually a paper mill company. And once they got into the transportation side of it, they saw a way to turn that into a viable railroad. So that's basically what I did. So geographically, everything in my freelance railroad is on a map. You can find it, and a lot of the traffic flows exist, but it's just, you know, a different color and a different railroad, and I, you know, all the nuances of the operations of the railroad I get to pin as a freelancer. So that's
so if we were to look at this in this sense of freelancing, you've done your own version of what KCS is doing today. Yeah,
that's a good story for it. So, or that's a good way to put it. when I moved from Mandeville, Louisiana, as a very young child to New Orleans growing up, there was a piece of railroad in New Orleans called the New Orleans Terminal, which was a subsidiary of the NS. And basically that was a micro Meridian Speedway, if you will, because even though it was only, I don't know, maybe 10 miles long, it connected at the west end of the New Orleans area, the Illinois Central and the Kansas City Southern and the Missouri Pacific, Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, Union Pacific, with at the eastern end, the Norfolk Southern and the CSX. So growing up there in my late elementary and high school years and college years, that was the railroad that was just a mile or two from my house. And so I got to see, traveling across the New Orleans terminal, all of these traffic patterns from East Coast to West Coast, and Texas to Birmingham and stuff like that. I watched it get handed off, and I would see how long it would take some of this traffic to move. 24 hours for a train to get across New Orleans, and then we had hurricanes every year, and I would watch how all these railroads would have a several day long shutting down process. They would evacuate all their equipment, and then once the storm was over, they had to assess the damage and then bring everything back. And sometimes it would be a few days before operations are back to normal. Sometimes it would be.
I was always curious about, like, when you guys have hurricanes and tornadoes over there, what exactly the railroads do. Like, you're saying they evacuate. Is that like get everything just as far away as you can?
Yeah, well, it depends on the forecast, the accuracy of the forecast. Some of these storms will turn on a dime. So, if it looks like, a storm is going to cross the path of, just out in the middle of nowhere and not hit any terminals, the railroads may not do anything other than just stop running trains at that point in time. But if the forecasts say the storm is coming directly for New Orleans, or it's coming directly for Mobile, or it's coming directly for Lafayette, say, or Houston, the railroads will start taking all their yard equipment, locomotives, switch engines, cars that they can, and they'll build what they call hospital trains, is what we call them in the business, and run them to a location where they think that the severity of the storm will not damage the equipment. So, like in New Orleans on the Norfolk Southern, that may be running a couple of trains of equipment to Meridian, Mississippi, or Birmingham, or the SP might move their stuff from New Orleans to Lafayette, or the Illinois Central will take their stuff up to Jackson at the time. So you watch this process and you realize, well, just how interrupting is this to the international or national flow of traffic? And what if that traffic pattern, instead of going West Coast traffic, instead of it's running along the Gulf of Mexico into New Orleans and Mobile or up that way, what if it made a left-hand turn at Alpine, Texas, and came onto this railroad, and instead of the transition happening there at New Orleans, really between all these different railroads, what if that New Orleans terminal was actually a much larger railroad, a little further north, and it was high speed, and it did not have all the congestion of the city and all of the drawbridges and all of that? So that's where the storyline comes into my Meridian Speedway, where we feed traffic patterns and business and structure into how the railroad would run.
So you're sort of like shortcutting around, almost shortcutting around New Orleans in a way.
In a way. Let's see here, models, maps. Let's see here. Maybe to create a visual. I did not go high tech with a map on the railroad, but can you see the cursor as I move it around?
Microsoft Paint. Yep.
Here is,
there we go.
Here is New Orleans, and here is Houston, San Antonio. So you have your flows of the stuff coming off the SPUP would be down here. This being the Gulf of Mexico down here, and it would hand off to the Norfolk Southern or the CSX at New Orleans, and you've got the Illinois Central, you've got the KCS. To get from this point right here to this point right here, which would be in recording.
All right, take 3.
Take 3 after
Getting-
technical difficulties.
yeah, trying to get those electrons all the way across the world.
Yes, sir. Let's go ahead and share the
All right,
screen. I
let's
think,
get back to the map.
yes, let's talk about the map. So part of what goes into designing a freelance railroad is understanding and coming up with a blueprint for the traffic patterns. You know, and that'll drive what kind of locomotives you're going to have, cars, schedules, etc.
Well,
So,
if we're looking at, if we talk about that just quickly,
Mhm.
you know, just a really general way to say it is like, what's the reason for its purpose?
Exactly. What does it serve to do?
Yeah.
So this railroad, the short-term philosophy would be the number of paper mills in this part of the world here. There was concern in my story when the Illinois Central was going to spin off this property that they would lose access to timber and forest products if the railroad disappeared. And then as it became that and progressed a little bit, those companies or that company saw what the KCS saw in this route, and that is its potential to be a bridge route between the Western railroads and the Eastern railroads. And bypassing all of the risk that is on the Gulf Coast and the congestion of New Orleans bypass, the congestion of Houston bypass, the congestion of San Antonio bypass. So that's really what went behind developing the story that is my freelance Meridian Speedway. So all of the traffic that I saw in New Orleans, connecting the Southern Pacific, now BNSF, Missouri Pacific, now Union Pacific, KCS, still remarkably now the KCS, the Illinois Central, now Canadian National, Norfolk Southern, and CSX, you know, all of that traffic was flowed from parts of the country into New Orleans to interchange. You did have a lot of originating traffic in the chemical corridor between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, but that was only a small piece of the overall picture. So the distance from where the railroads converge and those routes converge here, which would be around Alpine, Sanderson, Texas, and here in Meridian or here, just a little bit further where it touches the CSX, that distance, straight as an arrow almost, is not any greater. In fact, it's a little less than going through all these cities and along the Mississippi Gulf Coast and then going up that way or that way. So, you know, at a high level view, this is a competitive high-speed alternative to the way traffic was currently flowing. So all of the stuff that I saw moving through New Orleans, I decided, what if we moved it from down here to up here? And you know, the storyline was the paper mills that had first bought that Illinois Central spinoff from here to here, as they got into the railroad business, saw the potential of this route and decided to go after it. So that's kind of what I've done in my storyline.
No, it definitely makes sense. And it's, you know, a lot of railroads I've noticed in the US would sort of do things like that. Like you'd have the coastal sort of route, but then you'd always find like this little inland sort of line that you'd, yeah, it would be the same sort of thing, like a much safer, almost straighter kind of route. Sort of depends what part of the country, really, I guess.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely got parallels to the prototype, and obviously it is a prototype in
It
the
gives me a
real world.
storyline, but it lets me,
Yeah,
you know, run the railroad my way and make it look like what I want to look
yeah.
like. So I can have that creative artistic license. Now, where did the power come from? How much do I need, etc.
Mm. And I guess if you ever get really, really stuck, you just sort of look at what KCS has done, and there's the answer.
To a point,
That's,
yes.
yeah.
To a point, yes. There are some other parts in here that are not the KCS, but you know, this portion here would be the Fort Worth and Western short line. And you know, I have also in my high school and college years made a number of trips to Mexico, probably 8 of them, just driving around, looking at railroad things. You know, I've driven all over most of the northern states of Mexico, and I've ridden the Copper Canyon. And a lot of people don't think of it or realize it, but Arthur Stillwell, one of the original railroad pioneers on the continent, recognized that the route from here to the Gulf of Mexico here in Mexico was actually shorter than any route from here to the ports of Long Beach or Los Angeles. Now, you've got a significant mountain range here, which makes lengthy trains or that is a viable route very challenging and not much. But in the what if scenario, this here route to the Gulf of Mexico or via the connection here at the border at Presidio Hinaga, now all of a sudden this becomes a connection from the Northeast via connections with the CSX and Conrail and NS to an alternative to most of the traffic, of course, would go to Los Angeles or whatnot. But you know, that's a feat that was part of the vision, or that's a fit that was part of the vision of Arthur Stillwell. That
Was he was he behind, I think it's the Chihuahua El Pacifico?
That was part of it, yes.
Yeah.
He's behind the KCS in Louisiana and Arkansas. Had a lot of history there. In fact, I think I've got on the website here a library, and I've had a number of people write essays specifically for this website to both create a you know, some history, some background for both the model railroading aspect and the actual railroad itself. And I thought I had an article on Arthur Stillwell, but I don't see it at the moment. It's probably in here somewhere. But there's a number of articles on here to read.
No, I did have a I've had a
completion.
skim across your site, and
sir.
yeah, there's definitely a lot of articles there that I think there was one guy you were telling me about off air on Messenger who actually wrote a fair few.
Yeah, well, Russell Tedder himself actually wrote a few.
That's it, yes.
Yes. Real quick, this article on the completion of the KCP&G, which eventually became most of the KCS, this talks about that route being the shortest one to the Gulf of Mexico. And Russell Tedder, who was the gentleman that was the president of all of Georgia Pacific's railroads, wrote several, and he's since passed away, and I've actually got several more articles that he has written that I haven't published yet that I will add over the next few years. But he loved this model railroad concept. He sent me, you know, we've got quite a few email exchanges. He hired on as a kid as an operator and later a dispatcher for the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf Road in Florida. And this is, you know, some pictures he's taken.
Definitely had a colorful career.
He had a very colorful career, and he's got some more articles he's written about working through strikes and what that's like, and just various things that paint the picture. But Russell Tedder was a big fan of this railroad. He said, you know, I always wondered what this paint scheme would look like on big power. You know, those GP28s are the biggest power they had, and he was really excited about that. So it's kind of cool that, you know,
he'd probably be thinking like us, like, oh, got these grand ideas for a basement empire.
Well, he retired in Arkansas in the Little Rock area, and he did have a HO railroad in his head upstairs. So, you know, there's a lot of people who have an interest in railroading growing up that do gravitate towards professional railroad jobs.
I'd only be natural, really, wouldn't it?
It would only be natural, yeah. So he had a very unique story, and he loved to write. I mean, you can see by the length of these stories, he loved to write. So when I reached out to him and said, hey, I'm putting together a library on this website so that visitors can get more of a feel for the history that I've experienced, you know, as I put this together, he was very excited about writing articles for it. So there's several of them on here that he has penned. I think he passed away maybe 2-3 years ago.
Yeah, he's definitely a prolific writer. And the one thing that I noticed too is it's not really like, it's not hard to get through. I mean, you can sit there and read it and you kind of get lost because he's just that well sort of written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So yeah, the guy definitely had a passion for it.
he did, and I'm quite proud to have his history and his insight and his interest as part of the Meridian Speedway story that I've created.
Yeah, it's definitely something good to have on there.
Let's see, what else can I show you? Or do you have other questions or?
We've talked about, you've come up with the how we've gotten here sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The maps, we're looking at the rosters. Another thing that I didn't quite touch on with Drayton, but
Mm-hmm.
I sort of looked at in my first podcast, is rolling stock.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're doing home shops, which is obviously the grain cars that are coming out. What sort of leads you to the like picking the different cars that you're gonna have for your railroad?
For the Meridian Speedway or home shops
Yeah.
choices?
Meridian Speedway, sorry.
So this, as I started putting this together, it became clear to me that this is going to be a bigger than a large regional railroad, basically a class 1 type railroad, which means almost anything is fair game to have on the freight car roster. So I've got an equipment rosters page here, and I've kind of lumped the Texas and Great Northern and the Natchez Trace and Orient in together. Because the railroads are intermingled. I have some other short lines and creations, the Yazoo and Mississippi Valley and the Mississippi Central, or feeder lines in Vicksburg, other former IC pieces that we put together. But I've created rosters that are kind of living documents.
Yeah.
And I really liked the mixing of the Natchez Trace and Northern and the Texas and Great Northern reporting marks and logos and keeping them together. So, in my mind, you have a need for obviously grain cars. You think of a unit grain train being 100 to 125 cars long in the real world. So if your grain network is going to serve 3 or 4 export port facilities, and not only do you have a couple of originating locations on your railroad where unit grain trains would load at elevators that are on your property, but you would also interchange trains from the Union Pacific and the Burlington Northern and the Santa Fe that would load grain trains in Kansas or the Midwest. And there would be these cycles, where your equipment is going that way. It would not be unreasonable to think that any one time there could be 15 or 20 grain trains on this massive network. So if you multiply that by 100 to 125 cars a piece, you figure out how many cars of a certain type of in just analyzing the grain network would you need. And if that's, if you're modeling just an Appalachian coal railroad in, West Virginia, there's mountains there, not as much. Yeah, a lot of coal cars you would have, but you wouldn't have a whole lot of grain cars. But if you're modeling a railroad like this that does have connection to several Gulf ports for export, and it's got access to the Midwest through connections, and in Texas and Louisiana there is agriculture, so unit trains can be loaded. Having several thousand covered hopper cars for grain service are not would not be unreasonable for a roster on a railroad like that once you look at it that way. So I do have this page here, and I've got the quantity of cars, the number series that way would be. As a modeler, you wouldn't see a real railroad have Pullman standard 4750s that are tangent cars, and then Pullman standard 4750s that are intermountain cars. I think I've got them in a series somewhere. But I tried to kind of group all of the different type of cars in a general number series, but I left room in between a lot of these cars because who knows what model is going to be available next year or 5 years from now or 10 years from now. That would be a perfect plug-in fit to this story. And if I limited, the capability of this roster to only include what was available at the time that I made the roster, you don't leave yourself any room to add something at a later date. So there's a lot of gaps in the numbers and a lot of lot of room to add stuff too. So, you know, all the box cars are in this series, a lot of gondolas in this series, a lot of hoppers in that series.
Yeah, I was about to say, I've noticed on one of them it says 1980 build, so you've definitely thought about like how many cars you might have being ordered at different sort of years and
Yeah, and
just sort of,
that's an
yeah,
offshoot of home shops and tangent scale models. So
yep.
if we can talk about that for a little bit, and I do have, of course, a blog on here.
And we've got all the time.
So I reached out to David Lell back at Tangent, kind of just with an idea, and told him that I was very interested in his 4750 and the covered hopper, and would like to maybe commission some to be done in freelance roads for sale by a new company that I'm starting. He was very supportive of that, and they did that, and it everything aligned to where it looked like it would be viable on paper as a business to start with that car. Now with Tangent, unlike with other companies, and not knocking them, but with Tangent, every car they make is a very specific car. I mean, they've been doing PS 4750s for many years, but they're not all the same car. They've had very specific 1972 versions and very specific 1975 versions. And he said that, you know, Tangent was going to place an order with the factory this year for 4750s, and they were going to do very specifically the 1979 and the 1980 version of the cars that rolled out of the Pullman Standard Factory in 1979 and 1980. So
Yep.
to the point that you notice that on the roster, once that came to pass, and I said, okay, well, I you know, locomotive, hang on one second, where do I have it? Equipment rosters. Once I you know, saw that, I thought, well, I need to make sure that these cars are very specifically in the roster, and I plugged
make
them
sure
in.
that there's a
Yes, so
spot in there.
I
So you're
put
looking at
in,
it from a timeline kind of point of view.
correct. You know, if you go to Intermountain and say I want a PS 4750 where there's, you know, one body style, and it, you know, it will loosely represent the entire range. So with that being what was available many years ago when I originally created this roster, I didn't put much more thought into it. But now, you know, if I go to Tangent 5 years from now and say I want to do another run of 4750s, and they say, well, you're good to go, but this year we're ordering the 1972 version, right?
Yep.
I would put them in a earlier number series than this, and, you know, maybe plug them into this series here, see what fits, so that, you know, everything is kind of chronological. Everything has a place, and when it's all seen together, having this blueprint behind the scenes, it should make seeing a train roll across a railroad that much more coherent and believable.
Because you're not sort of stuck to just one car or a
Mm-mm.
specific build year of cars. You've got like, you can see a bit of progression over the years as
Correct.
cars have gotten older and new stuff's been bought.
Correct. So that's kind of how I put together that that roster. But a big part of the way I put this railroad together is what I call business units, which a lot of different railroads have in the real world behind the scenes. They run a lot of individual railroads accounting wise internally within the umbrella of the larger railroad. So, you know, within a large railroad, you might have, you know, a group that is only carload business. You know, we're gathering and distributing from cars to and from customers that may only load 1 or 2 cars. And you've got your intermodal business unit, and you've got your agriculture business unit, and you've got your, I call them the cycle train business unit, you know, for your coal trains and your unit grain trains that are going back and forth. And then you identify each one of those components and figure out, okay, well, how big is this component going to be? How many loadout places would you have for each one of these business groups? And then you can figure out from that do the math on how many cars do you need to support that, and what type of, or what size of locomotives do you need to support that. And then once you've got that blueprint, you can have fun with it and say, okay, well, I know that to run this many grain trains, I'm going to need this many 3,000 horsepower locomotives, and then you can have fun with, well, what do I make those look like now? How many do I have on the roster, and what do I want? So that's the fun part. Well, it's all the
And
fun part.
for me, I've probably taken it just a little bit further, because I've
Yeah.
almost gone like I follow the same path. It's like, all right, my railroad's this long. It's going to take this amount of time on average for a train to get from one end to the other. So we'll factor that in as basically how many trains can get over the line, but those different trains, what can use the same equipment more than once in a day. So locomotives, for example, you might think, oh, I'll need 50. But in reality, when you actually operate it, you might only need like 25. And so I look at that, and then it's like, all right, if I can use these more than once, and then you probably need a couple of locomotives to cover like servicing. And it might be the same with rolling stock. You might have just a few extra to cover cars that have been bad ordered or set out waiting for a hospital train to come pick them up, for example. So I'll usually end up with something like the number I work off is I'll multiply the end number that I get by about either a quarter or about 20%. And it sort of gives a number of, all right, this much extra covered. But then again,
that's good.
And then, and then you look at, with yours, you've got the carload business unit and the intermodal and all that. Some of those might even be able to share equipment on the same day. So you'd have to you'd sort of look at that, like you could cut yourself off. I've got enough power for the railroad, and just say like that. You could be like, all right, this unit needs this much power, but in a day it might be able to lend this much to this other unit. And so overall, you might actually have less than you think you're going to need.
Correct. Yeah, and it's, there is flexibility once it goes from the planning phase to the operations phase, excuse me, of running a railroad. So, you have everything, all the resources that you think you need to run the railroad, at a paper level. But, if you have a grain train running and there's, a locomotive failure on that train, in the real railroad world, you're going to grab the next locomotive you can to replace it and get that train moving, whether it's an engine that might be in the intermodals, in your intermodal network or your coal network. You're not going to let a grain train sit on the main line and wait there until you can get another quote unquote grain train locomotive to it. You're going to move it. So things do get mixed up. And I created this railroad business category here, which I envision as being kind of a surge fleet or an internal lease fleet, where there's several hundred engines that are not necessarily assigned to one of the business groups. But if we're behind, the railroad is behind in the coal cycle, or it's a part of the year, like around Christmas, where you have a surge in your intermodal business, these locomotives could be shifted by design to the corridors where they're needed. So that's something I've kind of created there.
Almost like a Conrail and LMS that they had.
Kind of like that, except they would, in my world, they would be green and white, just like these, the rest of them. But I stand, just because I think it's kind of cool. We'll look at the locomotive roster page. And you can kind of see here, ABU is assigned to that one. This is an IBU engine. I stenciled the business unit on the locomotive. And, each
is that just ahead of the road number?
Just ahead of the road number on the cab, and in little italic numbers, because I don't want it to be intrusive, but I wanted to, I thought it would be kind of a cool detail to add that, when you see a stack train flying across the speedway and it's got 4 of these engines all marked for the intermodal business unit, things are the way they're supposed to be. And when you see a stack train flying by and it's got 2 coal motors on it, that probably things are, a little out of sorts. Maybe business is good, maybe something's going on, but it's just a level of interest. So I've assigned each of the business groups locomotives in a certain number bracket, and the railroad business units would be in the 9,000 series. And
you like me, you just put all the riffraff in the 9,000s.
Yeah, put all the junk up there. I think some of the prototype railroads like the UP used to do that as well. And then once you've identified your traffic needs for each business group and how many units you need, you just plug in the roster and off you go. So now, if I'm not obviously going to model this entire large railroad, but if I want to put a couple of locomotives together to run on a grain train, I've got a blueprint. Where what would the number series be? What would they look like? What model would they be? I've got Excel spreadsheets and stuff that I use that are not on the website, but where every locomotive is shop assigned to a specific shop, and so I've got the blueprint for I'm going to model this locomotive in this series. If I want to go down to the ag business unit, this is my rock trains, right? A lot of rock trains in Texas and Louisiana. I can pull some C40s, and I'll know which ones are assigned to which shop location, and it's paint and decal that engine.
And I know UP with their rock trains down in Texas, they usually just stuck basically heading for death, I would say. Locomotives down there like the AC 6000s, they ended up on the Texas rock trains at one point.
They did end up there for a while. Now everything kind of looks the same, but
well, yeah, everything's a GEVO nowadays. But do you follow the similar sort of things, like this service doesn't really require something super reliable, we can get away with just shifting the older stuff that way?
Well, yeah, and remember, I modeled 1996, so I did put a few more modern things on the roster just because some people have said, what about doing a train for a photo shoot for something out of your era? But most of in the 1996 era, this railroad would have a lot of secondhand power, a lot of the same SD40s, rebuilt SD40s, would be the bulk of it, and so they're as reliable as not so much what the locomotive is, but how well they're maintained, which is why I've got this network of shop systems across the railroad.
He's a thinking man.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like you've got reference material that a prototype modeler might have, where they might model just a small section of a real railroad, but all these other locomotives and everything still exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can pretty much do the same thing, sort of researching your own sort of material to be able to, yep, I need this, I'll need this. All right, these will be for representing these trains that we've got. And it's, there's some of the things that I've noticed over time with other freelance railroads and where they fail is that someone might do that. They'll model a small section of what they envision as a much larger railroad, but you might have some locomotives that, the numbers are sort of, why would they be so similar? Why have you got this? And then it all just sort of falls down because there's no sort of focus to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of think even at like the most minuscule lazy level, some kind of at least a general focus towards what you're doing definitely helps. And you've laid a groundwork that you don't really need to look at anything else to know where you're going and what you're doing.
Yeah, and to me, that's just as much fun, building the railroad in theory and in paper than necessarily modeling. As I developed this network, my goal was to model Vicksburg, and it still is. That's the piece. But as I created a concept that was much longer than that piece, and as I got into the details of the other pieces, I thought, and there's a lot of other cool pieces of this railroad that I could model and be just as happy, and they would have a completely different feel to it. And I thought, I wonder if I were to define the other chunks of this railroad that could make standalone models. So I made a list. I just call it franchise opportunities. If I were to if I were to either myself model a different piece, or as this whole freelance movement moves forward, somebody came along and several people have, expressed interest in modeling this railroad. There's kind of blueprints for different divisions or different parts of the railroad that would look different, but equipment could be interchanged back and forth, or as photographs of different parts of the railroad appear, it would all seem congruent because the engines are in a number series that are the same, and they have the paint schemes are the same, and so that's it's packaged up, ready to go.
Yeah, like you've over
We're
the years
looking
we've
for
seen.
we're looking for a few good division general managers.
Yeah, I guess the example I was giving is like the Utah belt.
Mhm.
You'll see a lot of people that have got like models of it, or there's like they've put a little section of it on their layout.
Mhm.
But finding a roster for the Utah belt past about the 90s is difficult.
Mhm.
Trying to like follow at least that, and whereas if someone wanted to do that with your railroad, they just go to this website and they've got
Mhm.
everything they need.
Yeah, and it's flexible. One thing, in the Utah belt, Mr. Broom, excellent work. No railroad is a party of one in the real world. You've got a lot of people that have custody of a small part of that railroad for its history, and then they move on, but the railroad exists. And your observation about, how do I find a current roster for this railroad or that railroad? Well, if those railroads are a party of one, then that person has to stay engaged and keep it current. But some railroads, and there's the same interest in the Virginian and Ohio, but Brad McClellan, Alan McClellan's son, is involved in that, and they're more open to people coming to them with ideas of, what about this car? Would it have been on the roster? Let's add it, and it stays a little bit more alive. And the
I've
same thing
noticed that.
here.
Like, have you found their historical society that's on Facebook for it?
I have.
Yeah, that's where I've seen most of Brad McClellan posting about it. And yeah, it's not so much as much detail as you've got. Like you've said, they're still open to ideas. Like I've
Yeah.
seen, as you've said, yeah. Oh, what about this railroad car? Or would they buy these locomotives in 1990, for example? And yeah, it's definitely one
So
of those things. Like
this
as you said,
roster and this schedule is left with enough open spaces as people come along. What about this? What about that? We'll have a conversation, and if it can be made to be a good fit, we'll include it in the story.
yeah, it's sort of like you've got the framework to
Mhm.
then build everything in between.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, you've definitely thought a lot about it. That's for sure. But it's just well thought out
Well, and this isn't an
versus
overnight creation. This
yeah.
this website here is probably 8 years old.
I know I've come
And
across it a long time ago,
Mhm.
probably 8 years ago. But yeah,
And the blog part on here is, I've kind of gotten away from it because I've been very, very busy with my day job, which we won't talk too much about. But starting home shops on top of that, in addition to everything else, I haven't done a whole lot of blog posting recently on this website. But a blog post is a very shareable thing. So as I for a while, I was very focused on creating my paint booth, and I've got a whole series of posts on the construction of my paint booth and things I've painted in the paint booth, and so any one of these blog posts, you can get the link to and share it to a Facebook group that might be interested, and it drives traffic to it. So that I learned a lot of the things I learned through doing this blog over the last 7 or 8 years are skills that I'm taking with me to the Home Shops website, and it has a blog as well that I'm putting together. I think there's maybe 11 posts on there, and I've got guest authors writing blog posts. So that's kind of fun, and those all become shareable things on social media that'll drive traffic back to the site and create a sense of community at the same time.
No, it's definitely making use of social media is definitely one of the things nowadays that if you kind of don't, you sort of get left behind in a way.
Correct. Well, yeah, you do. And that's, you know, to your point earlier about some railroads are out there, they never sell their AccuRail equipment, and others, they just fly off the shelf. You know, on social media, on Facebook, you've got groups that are dedicated to
Well, there's what, freelance modeling in a prototype world. I know it's one.
Yep,
There's
that's
the
one.
proto freelance modelers special interest group.
Mm-hmm.
There's another, what was it? Freelance, pretty much freelance railroading.
Yeah, here's the freelance model railroads page,
Yeah,
and
that's it.
there's a fella by the name of Patrick Harris that does a lot of custom freelance runs of AccuRail cars. Let's see if it comes up here. And, you know, this group has Patrick Harris. Maybe we shouldn't have too much of this, but here's a shipment of AccuRail cars that he had done very recently, and he posted a picture of, you know, he posted, hey, they're for sale on this group. This particular one has almost 4,000 members, and in a day he sold all 76 or 100 or however many he had. And, you know, he just posted a picture of the group of, here's all of them going out to be shipped. So, you know, social media, and here's, you know, he did a run of the Archer cars with AccuRail. Archer is a freelance railroad by Daniel Archer, who is in Kansas, and he actually has morphed or moved on from modeling the Archer Railroad to the West Falls Northern, which will be one of the cars in the first tangent release that Home Shops is doing. But this is a run that Patrick did that sold out in a day or two, and he did quite a few of these because Daniel Archer had done this particular car with AccuRail several years earlier, and it had sold out, and there's a lot of people that wanted it. So I did get a few of those myself. But these websites, because Facebook, by definition of the special interest groups, it puts your niche market all in one place because people are interested in this little thing. So you can find people who might all be interested in buying a freelance car on these groups, and target your marketing towards that, or target, you know, the interest in that, versus you put an ad in Model Railroad magazine that may go to 30,000 people who have absolutely no interest in freelance modeling, you know.
You may not even see it, just float past on the page.
Yeah. Well, I probably ought to hide this.
I was about to say, somebody else talking to you about barrel ore cars? Jeez.
Yeah. We'll unshare that. That's one of the hazards of sharing screens. So, I wonder if there's a way to turn that off when you're sharing screen.
Just want to, if we want to just badly segue into home shops. One of the things, like, obviously the story's been told a few times, but the painting is probably one of the cooler things that I've seen coming out of this.
Okay.
The home shops painting that you've had commissioned. And I've not quite followed the updates on it from the artists, but I think the last one that I saw was actually getting fairly close to actually having the cars and everything mocked up in it.
Yes.
So anything you want to share?
So this is the first time I've commissioned a painting, so I'm learning a lot about working with an artist, especially about timelines and deadlines. So the backstory on the painting is, as I'm launching a new, I put the same amount of detail and thought into Home Shops as I have in the Meridian Speedway story. So you can imagine all the thought processes that are going on and all the variables that I figure out or think about. How do I make sure that I've practiced due diligence to move these cars when they arrive? So marketing a brand new company, selling freelance cars is a little bit challenging, but it's also opens the door for some creativity. And I thought commissioning a painting by a well-known artist of the 7 cars that are in the initial release, would put those 7 cars on the same medium, same playing field as prototype equipment, because a painting of Santa Fe hoppers would look just like a painting of freelance railroad hoppers. So I reached out to
Like,
several. Go ahead.
it's sort of like the old railroad paintings that we see like for advertisements and those
Mhm.
sort of things.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And at that time, I mean, in its infancy, I mean, this is like weeks after I had talked to Dave Lellback and decided we're going to do this. I'm having these ideas and following up on leads. So I'd reached out to several artists and ended up connecting with Robert West, who's been doing railroad art for 47 years, I believe. So he knows what he's doing. He's got a unique
Absolutely
style.
perfect person for it.
He's the perfect person for it. So just I sent him the artwork for the 7 cars, and my other job that we won't talk about, I do have a lot of experience in shop facilities and a lot of knowledge of the processes that go on in those shops, and a lot of photographs from inside of shops of different processes. So I was able to convey to him the activity that I would like on this painting. So all of the cars in the painting are going to have workers doing certain things to the cars, certain processes that you could see workers doing to cars if you actually stepped inside of a real shop. But it's
Yeah.
so when we had our initial conversations, Robert West and myself, about the painting, could it be done? Would he be interested? And the answer was yes, enthusiastically, to all of those. We decided to move forward, and at that time, which was maybe March, early March, late February, early March, he had anticipated the painting would be completed in the end of June, end of July. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start putting this website together, and I put a construction page up on homeshops.net, www.homeshops.net, to count down to a launch for the store. And I figured that I would have the launch be sometime when for sure I would have the paintings in hand. So I added 2 weeks to the contractual date. Well, we're a little bit beyond that.
Oop,
Oh, I've lost you.
nearly did.
There you
I
are.
was just about to. Oh my God. I thought it died for like the 4th time.
Well, I saw you sideways there for a second. I was hoping you were okay.
Oh, it's just Australia, you know.
Yes. So that timeline is a little bit further back. I just spoke to Robert, I think 2 days ago, and he thinks that he'll have it to the printer in 2 weeks, which in my mind probably is a month, probably. But there's a lot of detail there that's going into the paint scheme, into the painting, and he's keeping me in the loop on the process and asking a lot of questions about things he's added, and based on my feedback, there's a lot of changes being made to the painting. So I'm extremely pleased with that, and we're looking at, very shy to advertise a date when it'll be in hand. So since I already had the countdown to the website, to the launch of the website in process, and I had people that would actually reach out to me and say, hey, only a month to go, hey, only 3 weeks to go. When it became evident that the painting would not be ready at the time of the launch, I had to make a decision. Do I change the date for the launch to coincide with the painting, or do I launch the site on schedule without any products to buy, or do I do something different? So let me see if I can share the screen here. Here we go. Share. So this is the Home Shops site, and it launched on August 7th, which is we're now about 3 weeks from the launch date. And what I did was I made the cars from our 7 roads available for pre-sale. So I decided I would have 2 price points. I'm offering them for pre-sale for $49.95, which is only $1 over MSRP for these tangent cars. And so people who want them for sure can get them, know that they're going to have them, and they'll get them at a price cheaper than the in-stock price, which will be $5 more per car, $54.95.
Yep.
So there's the 7 roads. You've got Joe Loggins, his Arkansas Valley. You've got the Copper State Railroad, which was created by a fellow that has published quite a bit by the name of Brian Bana, and now that railroad's been taken over by Matt Martin. The Gulf and Ship Island is one of the pieces to my Meridian Speedway. You've got the Kansas Pacific, which is a freelance railroad created by Anthony Lorch, and a lot of the imaging was done by a fellow named Hank Stevens. The Michigan Interstate is the creation of Greg McComas, who I know very well and is very close to the house here. And he also owns a company called MacRail LLC, creates a lot of neat HO products. Of course,
and we'll hopefully have Greg on at some point.
Hopefully, well,
him.
I talked to him last night, as a matter of fact, and harassed him about it. So I wanted to make sure he knew that I was on before he was. So all is well. The Texas and Great Northern we've discussed in detail on this podcast. And then there's the West Falls Northern car, which is the newer creation of Daniel Archer. And just for an example of what the pages look like, you can.
And this is all the artwork that Tangent has given you.
This is with the Tangent artwork. And I put tabs at the bottom of each page with some of the car specifications, a tab with a little bit about each railroad, so that it's right there on the website without having to leave it. Somebody browsing it can discover and learn a little bit about what the railroad is. In the create a visual, I put a photo album for each railroad tab, so that what would a West Falls Northern
sort of get the idea of it, yeah.
So that exists for each of the railroads, and I was a little nervous, because there's a lot of animosity, or I don't know, that's the word, but if you pre-sell cars or have cars to pre-sale, it could be received one way. So I was prepared to sell like 5 of them and see a whole lot of negative press online, and quite the opposite has happened. So
yeah, I think the whole pre-order sort of negativity is kind of, people have almost gotten over it in a way.
I think so.
So like, it's kind of a yes and no. Like, I'm sort of categorizing groups, but the older modelers that we've still got around, a lot of them can be a bit stubborn about things, but the generation that I'm guessing, I would say I'm a part of, because I'm barely 30, it's guys like me that are like, yeah, we'll use this, because we kind of, at least for me, it was growing up, you sort of, if you had the money, you could get these things. If you didn't, oh well, you missed out. But now it's sort of like there's less of a chance of being able to miss out. So it's a better choice than waiting around until it shows up and then, oh wait, no, there's none left.
And I've been on both sides of that equation myself. So I think I've ordered enough of these cars that it will be a while before they completely sell out, because I'm very concerned about people coming to the site for the first time and there not being anything to buy. And that's why I decided to pre-sell these cars. And we're only 3 weeks into it here, and I had an order this morning that was order number 110. So we've pre-sold quite a few of these cars, but there's still enough left that I don't think any of the roads are going to sell out, at least in the next couple of months. And there are people that have come to me and said, I can afford 4 of them this month, and can I get 4 more next month and ship it, when the cars come in, we can roll multiple orders into
the pre-purchase price only ends once they show up, right?
Once they show up, correct. So I want to reward people for getting them early, and it's helping me make some decisions about other projects I'm working on right now with Tangent and one other manufacturer. And it's also very capital intensive. Greg McComas and his MacRail LLC, the turnaround time between when he invests in, I'm going to develop a product and print it and sell it, is much shorter than the year when I have to write a very large check to Tangent and then just sit here and twiddle my thumbs and wait for the clock to tick as the deadlines come by for other cars. They come and go. So the pre-selling helps compress the timeline greatly between when I can
get some sort of return.
Start the wheels turning on the next project.
Yeah.
So that's actually having a great impact on one of the projects that I'm working on right now. So, which will be announced soon. We're pretty excited about them.
That's no, I won't say anything.
Fair enough. I did put you'd mentioned the painting. I think that was a segue here, was the painting.
Yep.
I do have a page for the Home Shops painting on here. At the time of the launch, this was the most current photograph I had from Robert West. It's developed quite a bit since then, but it started with this sketch here. When I told him I wanted a shop floor, I wanted something that would be, when people think, what is Home Shops? Is it a place where you go to get your kitchen counter redone, to do your garage door, or what is it? I wanted a visual of a car shop. I wanted people to very quickly be able to associate this with the car shop. And to make this,
that's what that definitely is.
That's definitely what this is. And I said, I would like there to be nothing but PS 4750s in this painting. And I want all 7 of the road names from our initial offering to be in this painting, so that this would be a very specific work of art commemorating the launch of this company, Home Shops, which maybe it'll fail next year, but maybe it'll be around 20 years from now. Who knows? I'm betting on the latter.
No, I'm fully, from what I've seen, I'm fully expecting this to hang around for who knows how long.
Well, I appreciate that.
It's one of
fun,
those,
so I'm hoping so.
yeah, it's
So
one of those
this is,
untapped sort of markets, really,
it
in
is.
terms of, like, it just hasn't been done like this before.
I've been accused of doing things differently for a long time. So when we had our initial conversations, Robert and I did, he FedExed this sketch to me, and you can kind of see it's got people in a lot of different positions, and this was his initial vision of it. And I looked at that and thought, this is perfect, and signed it and said, let's go with this initial concept. And this is kind of the blueprint for the floor on the actual painting. So Robert West does a lot of social media posting himself. And I saw that and I thought, I wonder if he would be interested in turning this into a social media project where he would take video clips and update and post along the way. And he was all about that, a lot of excitement, and he said yes. So we weren't really sure what that was going to look like at first. And I thought at first he posted the first couple of updates, and I thought, we're drawing a lot of attention to the painting with these updates, and there's no painting to get at this point in time. So in order to turn that interest at that time into connecting that person with actually the picture painting when they're being able to purchase it, would mean we would have to reach out to that person, find that person, and connect them with it at that time. So Robert and I talked, and we decided maybe we should wait to unload or unveil or share all of these video posts until such time as the painting is there to get, and we just put out a couple of teasers along the way to keep the interest out there. So he's up to, I think, 21 videos that he's filmed so far, and clips. And I think only 4 or 5 have actually been shared on Facebook, just so that it's out there.
Fair bit of content to come.
Fair bit of content. So, imagine once I've got these pictures in hand, if every week or every 2 weeks I launch or, advertise in sequence one of his videos, that's 6 months, or a year of fresh content, drawing people to this, and then the painting will be there and available to purchase for those who see fit or who are interested, or it'll create a lot of excitement and focus towards Home Shops. So that's what.
Well, it's not just, you're not just going to be able to get a model railroad car. There's going to be 500 copies, I believe I've heard somewhere,
of the painting
itself.
Yeah, there'll be 500 copies of the painting.
Yeah, so you're going to be able to not just get a model, but you can also have a great painting to hang in your room, hang in your basement with the railroad.
Something I hear a lot from model railroaders is they lose motivation. They'll burn out and overload on it for 2 or 3 months, and then they'll walk away from it for a year. And one of the thoughts I had is that this painting, you know, of this home shop, these workers doing their thing, if it's hanging up in someone's club or someone's own personal, whatever room in their house or basement that they do all their work in, I wanted something that would be kind of inspirational and focusing on working on trains, and that's part of the conversation Robert West and I had early on, when we decided to put the activity. And I think he said there's going to be 18 workers depicted doing various things. You know, this car is actually going to be on jacks, and there'll be 2 workers rolling the trucks under this car, and the gantry crane will actually be suspending the end of this car up, right? And here you have a worker applying a grab iron on the end of the car, and here you've got an employee welding on the draft gear. And part of what go ahead.
I might be about to say what you're about to say, or at least ask you about it.
Okay, go.
I know with the Copper State cars, they've got the metallic logos. And I believe not only are they going to be in this painting, but the welding, as you're about to say, now that's a special paint that he's using.
He uses fluorescent paints, which very cool. He did recently post a video where he shows this painting under different lights, and under some certain lights you can really see the glow on the floor underneath all of the lights that are above. And the welding spark showers are going to be fluorescent paints. And this particular car position here, we've decided to be the Copper State Railroad car, because it will have right here on the close end a very large metallic copper logo, which in itself without fluorescence is a very reflective deal. And there's going to be a welder working on this car here right adjacent to it. So not only will you have the sparks flying from the welder, but you'll have that with Robert West's magic, that logo is going to come alive on that car there. So, you know, these are the kind of detailed conversations that we have about every one of the employees in this car, in this painting, and every one of the cars in this painting. There's a little thought behind it. This painting's
going to be like as cool as the actual models themselves.
I hope so. I appreciate hearing that.
Something to look at.
Yes.
Because it's like, it's not often that you get a painting that's more than just the color. You've got like the life almost as part of it that's in there.
And the original painting that he is doing on canvas right now, the original size is 30 by 40. And he was sending me screenshots that looked like this, and I didn't realize the enormity of the painting until he sent me this shot. And here is his hand working on the Arkansas Valley lettering. Now that is this car here that is just in this corner. He's scaled that up,
hasn't he?
Yes. So it's, I mean, this is the same spot here. So
that's crazy.
At first, I was, you know, when I hadn't really developed the home shop's website, I thought one of my primary purposes for this painting would be to have something to use, you know, as the banner or heading image at the top of the very top of the pages. And, you know, from a painting this large, there are actually going to be contained within it, from a resolution size, 10 or 12 or 13 individual photographs that you can clip, you know. So I'll get a lot of mileage out of this painting, as far as, you know, any one of these railroads, you know, the resolution will be there. I can have a screenshot of that car in this shop, and it will be like you're right there, right next to this car, because the photograph is, or the painting is just that large.
Yeah, and the photograph.
Well,
it almost is this.
There's a lot of detail. And, you know, at first he told me that he didn't realize that he worked with fluorescence, and I didn't really understand what that meant. And then I looked at one of his videos where he had been contracted by UTLX, the tank car company, the real tank car company, to do a series of artwork for, I guess, their headquarters. And I think he did 10 or 12 paintings of shop facilities and shop scenes. And it was looking at some of those that I was able to understand what he meant when he said he works with fluorescence, and it'll make, you know, things come to life. And he and I have just run with conversations. This particular car right here, you know, when a shop employee does the inspection of a freight car, they basically tackle different zones. And one of the things an employee would do on one of these cars is come up to the top, and he would walk all the way around it to inspect the walkway to make sure that it's all secure and none of the bolts are loose. And then he'll open up all the doors, make sure that the hinges are working properly, that the doors aren't damaged. And then he'll get a flashlight and walk and look inside the car to see, what's going on in there. And I said, what if we took the top hatches on this car that's front and center, opened them up, and we put an employee on the top looking inside that car with a flashlight with your fluorescence? And he thought that would be a fantastic effect, right? So we've had a lot of those conversations. So that's why, in this stage here, this car has the beginnings of the open trough hatches, and the dark interior of the car will contrast greatly with the fluorescent flashlight beam of an employee who will be holding it, looking inside the car for whatever may need to be inspected.
Yeah, that is just cool as that. Yeah, you can just, like, years ago you wouldn't have thought, oh, you'd be doing this sort of thing with paint, but it's just amazing where we've come to.
Well, I told him he's been practicing 47 years for this painting. I expect it to be perfect.
Yeah, he's
very good at what he does. He's very good at what he does, and it's just been a pleasure to work with him. So, given that we've had these conversations going along, some of the delay is certainly my fault, because as this progresses, I throw at him, hey, what about adding this or positioning this car, or because in the original sketch, this car was not rolled into the scene that far. In the original sketch, that car was right here. And when I had the idea of opening the trough doors, I said, what if we took this car and rolled it into the scene, the equivalent of 10 or 12 scale feet, so that you could actually have the doors open. He rolled it halfway into there and opened up the doors, and so it's really a fun project. I mean, this is just as fun as working on the scenery detail of an actual model. To me, it is. And it's kind of cool to see the support. But we're gonna wait to release all of the videos until somebody sees this, and you don't lose that opportunity to connect them with the ability to buy it if they want, because I think that's just a marketing no-no to waste all your advertising and interest gaining on it without it being available to purchase. I think so. That's all coming.
It's like some of those models that you'll see, like it's happened in Australia a few times. The model gets announced, you obviously pre-order, or you might wait, and then you wait, and then you wait, and then you forget about it, and then you've totally forgotten about it, and then they might give an update 3 years down the track. Oh yeah, we're still doing it. And then you're waiting, and I think there's one model here that's been waiting for about 8 years. So you can imagine where the interest has gone with that.
Yep. And I've had people mention that to me and ask how this is different. And what's different, well, the painting is something we're creating from scratch, but as far as the actual HO scale cars, we're not inventing them. We're not waiting for financing, for tooling and artwork and that process. What we're doing is we're jumping on board an already existing pipeline. So
you're basically ordering units on top of something that's already out there.
We have extreme confidence in Tangent's production and manufacturing pipeline. And when Tangent says, we're going to order of these 4750s, we know that that's being done. We know that it's going to factory. And we know that they've been doing this long enough. They're comfortable with their timelines. And all we're doing is adding volume to that existing order. So there's no new tooling here. Hence, the 1979 and 1980 cars we're doing, because that's the exact car that they're doing. And so while the timelines are long, we're pretty confident that the biggest obstacle is not going to be, hey, I haven't found somebody to finance this project, so it's going to be 8 years from now, or hey, I haven't found a partner. But the biggest aspect is going to be shipping. I'm sure you're aware of some of the obstacles on a global scale right now, but there are containers that are taking 2 months to get from China to a warehouse in the United States right now. So
well, one of the things that I've been doing lately is been talking to a guy in Taiwan about producing some local models, looking at a locomotive. And one of the things that he's told me is that there's literally no containers available because they're all tied up.
Mm-hmm. It's a
It's just
strange
wild to
phenomenon.
think about, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And there's a lot of political and global reasons for
Mm,
that. That would be another conversation on a different genre of podcast, but that it is a very serious concern as far as
yeah.
advertising timeline. So, but we're talking of the difference between an uncertainty of a couple of weeks or a couple of months versus 8 years. We're confident that these cars are gonna arrive relatively
What's the
close to
general
the
lead
target date.
time that's stated? It's about 18 months from starting from scratch to having the first model. You've pretty much cut out all that development, tooling,
Correct. We've
all
cut out
that
all the
time.
development and tooling
Yeah.
time, so it's roughly now a 9 to 12 month process when you're
Mm,
just adding on to an existing product process.
mm.
Hence, we had this conversation in January of last year or of this year, and the order was actually placed in April, and we expect
So yeah, it's
January-ish it
roughly
should
that
arrive.
9 month sort of
Hmm.
timeline.
Correct.
Which yeah, you'd think about it, it's ridiculously quick for what could be perceived as a new model, but it really
Correct.
isn't.
Correct. It's just it's just adding volume to an existing model, making
Mm.
it appeal to a different audience, a different market.
Yeah, it's all definitely very interesting, and it's one of those things that personally, as someone who's like freelanced for God knows how long, I want to see a bit of success, I guess,
I appreciate
in
that.
just something that isn't the prototype. Like
Hmm.
we've got enough Gevos, don't we?
We've
Really?
got enough Gevos, and the Meridian Speedway will
There's
have Gevos in 2020, but but it used to be, in the 80s or the 90s, you would go to Colorado, and a big part of that trip was you got to see the Rio Grande Railroad, and you
Mm,
saw it there, and you didn't see it everywhere else. And you went to Texas, and you saw the Katy, and it was there. It wasn't, everywhere else. And you went to any place. You went to Northern California and saw the Western Pacific, and it was, these unique things. Now,
mm.
as you move around the country, all you do is change the percentage of which Gevos you're going to see, right? So
Pretty much just, oh, I
you
need
go
more
out on the,
UP Gevos, I need
yeah,
more
so
BNSF.
you go anywhere the quarter of the country's railroad network that has the UP, and 80% of the Gevos
Mm,
you're going to see are going to be UP ones, and you'll have some NS ones mixed in, some CSX ones, and some BNSF ones. And then you go to Pennsylvania on Horseshoe Curve, and 80% of your Gevos are going to be NS ones, and you'll have a few UP ones. And if it just
yeah.
it kind of, so freelancing now allows people to create and do something that is actually, hey, come look at my railroad, and it's actually going to be something different. The same kind of appeal that in 1980 going to Denver and watching the Rio Grande had. Now I think as people are looking for something different, something that's,
Mm.
all right, I'm going to spend all my time modeling to something that you can go anywhere in the U.S. and see. That appeal, I think, burns some people out quickly. Versus, hey, I'm going to spend my time doing this, and everybody who looks at it, barring
Mm.
the part of the model railroad market who just isn't into freelance at all, they're going to think that this is pretty cool, and they're going to recognize that this is something that is unique, right? So that, I think, fuels a lot of the interest in freelance modeling.
Yeah, it's just the way, like, I think I've heard the modeling, it used to be all about transition era. And
Mm-hmm.
that was definitely true when I first got into the hobby.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're slowly seeing it's gone to the 60s, now it's gone to the 70s, and then the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm starting to feel like we're what, 20 years away or 30 years away from 1990.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of, yeah, I was a kid during those years, and a lot of what was around then sort of influenced what I do today. And a lot of those things, like the equipment that was around then, is still around today.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think with the younger generation being that they've only ever seen what, 4 class 1s in the US,
Mm-hmm.
they're gonna probably be the ones that are gonna be like me that freelanced early on and see, oh, hang on, I can actually go buy something that, while it's not real, it's still something cool that's in somebody else's basement, sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So it was, to your point, I think the 90s have become today's transition era, right? When you and I
Mm,
were younger, the older, more established model railroaders, some of them actually were alive in the transition era, and that's what they wanted. And
And yeah, it's like, it's pretty much the golden rule, the man with the gold rules.
right.
And the large percentage of the market that's buying,
Hmm.
yeah, they really dictate what era is popular at the time. And that's pretty much, it's basically what we've gotten to now, with the 90s sort of becoming more of a thing.
I think so. I mean, I've got, you kind of see my wall of power back there. There's a
Yeah.
lot of 90s era models that when I first started this, you wouldn't have the road specific variations in individual locomotives that are available today. And
Well, no, what was it, back in 2000 something? You could get a SD70M or an SD70 Spartan cab, but
mhm,
you're only getting one body. You weren't going to get the specific details that you might get like
correct.
today. And yeah, it's the way things have evolved modeling wise. It's amazing to see,
Mhm.
honestly.
Well, that's it in a nutshell. I don't know if I've
Yeah, I think I think it's getting a bit late here, and my brain's starting to slow down a little bit. So I think we might call it there, to be honest.
understood. Well, I appreciate you reaching out early on in the Great Divide podcast. That's pretty cool. So I'm happy to be here from the beginning.
No, thank you. We'll
Best of luck
check in
for
at
the
some point
podcast.
down the future, I think. See
Yes,
how you're
sir.
going with not only home shops, but the Meridian Speedway.
It'll
So
be
I'm
around. So reach out
sure that'll
anytime.
follow. Yeah, I'm sure Meridian Speedway will follow a bit of home shops. We'll see a bit of, was it TNGN and
Natchez Trace.
NTNO?
Mm-hmm.
Good,
I'll
got
expect
that.
at some
Remembered
point
something.
I'll look at one of your podcasts and you'll have this painting hanging up in the background.
Yeah, I'll try and turn the echo chamber into something a bit more, something recordable from, and start decorating.
Very good.
Alrighty, well, definitely thank you for being on.
Well, thanks for having me. And as soon as I can figure this out, we'll
Just
hit the button.
end record. Should just be a little stop.